It's good to see you. This is the last week that you need to hear me talk about Judges, so I hope it's been useful. And if you want to talk more about Judges after this, I'm happy to talk more, or about other biblical topics. But this is week 3 of the series on Judges, and I've called it Retribution and Redemption, as we look at these kind of two themes of measure for measure punishment that happens on a number of levels in the book, and also God's grace working to save people through these unlikely heroes. Why don't we open with a prayer? Lord, thank you for bringing us together on this rainy morning as we celebrate Pentecost and the sending of your Spirit on your people. Please help us, empowered by your Spirit, to do the things that make for peace. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so this week we're going to be looking at, again, way too much text, the story of Samson, who's the last judge in the book of Judges, and then a little bit at the events that unfold at the end of the book in chapters 17 to 21. We won't be able to hit every moment, but we'll look at some key moments and passage from from Samson's story as on your handout that we'll look at together, and then try to wrap it up. Just before I dive into this, I would like to say a thank you to Ezra Gray for all his work over the course of the year. And so thank you for recording these and putting them up, and we couldn't do this without you, Ezra, so thank you. Okay, so just a little review before we go into the Samson story. Some of you have been here, some of you not. This book of Judges, it comes after Joshua. The Israelites have come into the land of Canaan. In history, this is the Iron Age, and the beginning of the Iron Age around the 12th century, 11th century BCE. The judges are, as we've seen, mostly military leaders, mostly not kind of judicial type, judging, courtroom type judges, although we did see that Deborah seems to give actual judgments, kind of judicial type judgments. But most of them are military leaders. We do see lone warriors like Shamgar, who's a minor judge, and Samson that we'll see today. So as I said, the series has been focusing on these two themes of kind of measure for measure punishment, the retribution side, that we see sometimes playing out implicitly or explicitly on a divine level. Sometimes it's human retribution. Sometimes it's could be seen as positive, bringing about justice. Sometimes it's kind of negative, taking revenge. And we'll see more of maybe the negative side, well, a little bit of both on the Samson story. And then we've seen throughout God saving his people through these unlikely heroes. So I have the characters that we looked at in the first 2 weeks up there. So first we saw Othniel. He's the first judge, and we don't hear much about him, but I called him a model judge because not only does he not do anything wrong, so he's a kind of positive model, he also, his little story provides in just a small little, in miniature, an example of the story as it plays out through the whole book of Judges. And then we looked at Ehud. He's the left-handed son of the right hand, because he's a Benjaminite, which means son of the right hand, but he's left-handed, and he's tricky. He uses deceit in order to get an audience with the Moabite king Eglon, and then sneakily kills him with his hidden sword and defeats the Moabites in battle. Then we looked at Deborah, and she is a prophet. She's the only prophet in the book of Judges, the only named prophet. She's also a judge, a wise judge, when people are coming to her for rulings on their disputes. So she's unlike most of the characters in the book of Judges, and a very positive character. And she gives the message to Barak, her kind of fearful military general, to go into battle. They go into battle, and then it's also another unlikely hero, Yael, the non-Israelite woman who ends up finishing off the enemy general with a tent stake at the end of that story. And then Deborah and Barak sing a song, the Song of Deborah, praising God. Part of it's about praising God for his deliverance. Last week we looked at Gideon, who we saw is kind of a mixed bag in terms of positive and negative qualities. He's fearful at the beginning of the story. He's cowardly, but God works with him in his weakness. God gives him the signs and the kind of the courage that he needs to defeat these Midianites in battle with only 300 men, and they end up not even really fighting. They're just breaking the jars and have the torches, and the Midianites just turn on each other. But then at the end of his life, he sets up this ephod that we don't know exactly what it is, but it leads people astray into foreign worship. So this is in the Gideon story. It's the first time that a judge leads the Israelites astray into idol worship. Before, they were doing that on their own. Then he has a son, Abimelech, and Abimelech is not a judge. He becomes a king, the first Israelite really to become a king. And we saw in that story about how the leaders, the people of Shechem, they choose a bad king. He kills all his brothers on one stone, and then they basically end up destroying each other. So the people choose a bad king. They turn against him. He turns against them. A lot of people die. In the end, Abimelech gets killed by a stone, just like he killed his brothers on a stone. He gets killed from a stone thrown by a woman off the wall. And so the first kind of experiment with kingship doesn't go too well. And then we have Jephthah, who's, I would say, another kind of, mix of bad and good, but we see some things turn to the worse, even worse than they were in the Gideon story, where Jephthah ends up sacrificing his own daughter, which is a kind of one of the main things that are bad about the Canaanites, is that they sacrifice children. Jephthah ends up sacrificing his daughter. He also starts this civil war, this intra-Israelite war, which in a similar situation, when Gideon was faced with a similar situation, when the Ephraimites came to him complaining that they hadn't been called to battle, Gideon calmed it down. He used kind words to diffuse the situation, and it didn't end up in violence. But Jephthah, faced with the same situation, stirs up trouble, ends up in this huge civil war with the Ephraimites. That's the scene with the Shibboleth, and ends up killing a bunch of Israelites. So we see really in what we looked at last week, a kind of turn for the worse in terms of the judges' leadership and the nation as a whole. And so that's where we left off when we get to Samson. And so Samson, if you're familiar with the Samson story, he's a very flawed character and a very flawed judge, and yet God also works through him. And so we'll see Samson, and then we'll zoom back out to the Israelites as a whole. Again, with the book began talking about all of Israel in chapters 1 and 2, and then at the close of the book, we return to all of Israel at the end. Any questions or clarifications from things we did in the past before I go on to Samson? Yes?
One quick comment. It's just striking to me that these stories of these, you'd think they would be heroic figures. Mm-hmm. Instead, they're shown to be like the rest of us, have their highs and lows. And it's so different from other kinds of legendary material from that time period, from the Egyptian lore, Mesopotamian lore, Babylonian lore. It's totally different. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good point. The people, yes, throughout, and not only in Judges, most of the rest of the Bible too, very flawed and compromised people that God works through. Yeah. All right, so first when we meet Samson, there's this kind of annunciation scene where an angel appears and talks to, at first, Samson's mother and then his father. An angel also appeared to Gideon. We didn't look at that part last week, but Gideon also has an encounter with the angel of the Lord. And Samson has a ton of echoes of other judges. We'll see some of these along the way, but a lot of the just vocabulary and themes and things like that come up in past judges' stories show up in Samson's instructions. So this angel comes. Obviously, this is a recurring motif in the Bible where there's a barren woman and she's able to miraculously conceive. In this case, the angel gives her these instructions about Samson's Nazirite status. So he's not supposed to, first the angel gives these instructions to her, the mother, but they extend to Samson as well. She's not supposed to drink wine or strong drink, eat anything unclean, or shave his head. In these, it says, he shall be a Nazirite to God from birth, and he shall begin to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. So a Nazirite, usually, if you look at Numbers 6, that's where the instructions for a normal Nazirite vow are. A Nazirite it comes from the word meaning to separate. So someone who wants to especially separate themselves for a period of time and dedicate themselves to God takes this Nazirite vow. Usually it's temporary, and they're not supposed to drink any alcohol, touch anything unclean, even in cases where normally it's okay to get corpse defilement for like burying a relative or something. Nazirites are not supposed to do that, and they're not supposed to cut their hair for the duration of the vow. But Samson is a Nazirite from birth. Samuel also looks like is a Nazirite from birth as well. So there's a couple characters who have this kind of lifelong Nazirite status. Also, it's interesting that the angel says he shall begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. So the word begin shows up at key points in the Samson narrative. For example, when his hair begins to grow back. But it's a kind of strange thing that he begins to deliver them, because all the other judges did deliver the people. The word is the same for the word we use for save. The judges saved Israel, but Samson only begins to save them. So already we see a kind of, he's a very flawed judge, and he's only going to begin to save them. And then if we look at these three things, the three elements of his Nazirite vow, of course the hair is the most famous one, the most well-known one. But some people have pointed out that he seems to break the other instructions of that vow as well. It's more implicit in the narrative. But as it goes on, first of all, once he's traveling and he kills this lion, and then when he comes back along, he sees the dead lion. And in the lion, there's a swarm of bees, which actually, in Hebrew, it's a congregation of bees, which is a very unusual. All the other places, a congregation refers to a group of people, usually the congregation of Israel. So it's interesting, you have this congregation of bees. Some people see kind of significance of the Israelites living in the midst of the Canaanites as the kind of the congregation of bees in the lion's carcass. Also, bee is Deborah. The word Deborah means bee. So these are Devorim, the bees are Deborahs. It's just another little hint kind of reminding of previous judges. But at any rate, he eats this honey out of the lion carcass, and he gives it to his parents. And this would seem to be something that's obviously unclean. So animal carcasses are considered unclean, and getting this honey out of an animal carcass would seem to be eating something unclean. And then when he gets married, and we'll look at the scene in a minute, they have a party and a feast. And this word feast, mishteh, in Hebrew, is from the word to drink. It's related to the verb to drink. And so it's like a drinking party. So it doesn't say that Samson was drinking, but he's at this drinking party. So we might also assume that part of the Nazirite vow was broken. These two are pretty subtle, and maybe we aren't supposed to understand them as breaking the vow, but it does seem like he has kind of broken the unclean, broken the alcohol part of it, and then of course famously at the end his head gets shaved, and that's the key moment when he loses strength and the kind of last straw on the vow part of it. Some people have suggested that Samson functions as kind of a symbol of all Israel. So he's kind of like an Israel in himself, and he's set apart with this Nazirite vow, just like the Israelites are set apart when God made the covenant with them at Mount Sinai. And just like the covenant gives these instructions for them to follow, they repeatedly break the covenant. Samson also seems to kind of repeatedly break the Nazirite instructions. And Samson, famously, he's always led astray by women, by foreign women. And in the Bible, Israel is led astray to worship foreign gods, which is often, there's a kind of marriage metaphor, adultery metaphor that's used for that. And so the idea that Samson, as this person who's like specially set apart from God, breaking the covenant, going astray, he might be a kind of not only a character and a judge in his own right, but kind of a symbol of all of Israel. So it's interesting that he's the final judge, and after we get these stories, we go on to these stories of all Israel, and we see how bad the situation has gotten. One more point on that is that when Samson wants to marry the first woman that he falls in love with, or he wants to marry this Philistine woman, it says that she was right in his eyes, which is not a usual thing that the Bible says about people. It's not a usual phrase. but she's right in his eyes. And there's this refrain that we'll see at the end of the book of Judges: everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The same language used about the whole nation of Israel, which is another kind of thing that binds together Samson and the nation of Israel. All right, so the text that we're going to focus on in the Samson story shows these various instances of revenge that play out in the story, and some of it's in a way measure for measure, but some of it is a kind of maybe like skewed version of measure for measure, where people are going after people that didn't actually do anything to them, and everyone's just kind of, it's a kind of wild mess of revenge. But first we're going to read the first section of it, chapter 14, 10 to 20. And this is on the handout here. And if you don't have a handout, you can look it up in your Bible or on your phone. So what I want you to do is read this passage, 14 to 20. It goes down to verse 20 here, where it says, Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man. Read that with somebody or a group of people sitting next to you, and just think about, what stands out to you, what's confusing to you, and what do you learn about Samson and his character from this passage. So go ahead and take 5 minutes or so to read through and talk about this.
You strike us as our kind of fellow.
Yeah, read out loud if you can.
Oh, then you shall give me thank you. So they sent him and asked what is sweeter? And he said, what is stronger than wine?
How would it be here in some
You have not out of his mouth. You have not spare the Lord response. And went on to ask. And for a very men of the town, except just the one, and gave a festival fire of his house. Hot anger showed back to his father's house. Samson's wife was given to him, who had been his best After a while,
Oh, you can stop there and discuss.
wow.
Stop at 14:20. another minute.
You know what that means? It means nagging words.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a good lesson to learn. I thought of it in terms of my kids because I was like, yeah, you know, when I was a kid, I used to think like, why Samson just give in always to women, and then you have kids and you realize it's hard to withstand constant nagging. All right, I would love to hear some of your comments, questions, things you learned about Samson, things you observed about the text in general.
Mike Samson made a mistake before the passage even starts, marrying the Philistine woman.
Well, yeah, it's interesting, and I should have pointed this out, that he wants to marry this Philistine woman. His parents are against it. And then it says, this is chapter 14, verse 4. His father and mother did not realize that this was the Lord's doing. The Lord was seeking a pretext against the Philistines, for the Philistines were ruling over Israel at that time. So it's a very interesting, again, we've kind of struggled with this through this whole series, this kind of divine causation and divine will versus human will. And so the whole thing is set up with Samson, yes, doing something that Israelites are not supposed to do, and his parents don't want him to do, and yet it says that God had actually planned it, or God was involved, God had approved it in some way. And so, yes, I think it is a mistake in one sense, and yet it's complicated by that fact that somehow God is involved in this. Mm-hmm.
And why would a whole chapter just before this give us a scene that makes us think of the angel coming to Mary
Yeah, it's
about
very
the birth of Christ? Why would Samson be introduced out of this miraculous birth that was proclaimed by the angel?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very auspicious beginning, and it does mark out Samson as someone who's chosen by God. He's miraculous. His birth is miraculous. I mean, I guess in other stories too, where you have a barren woman and she's able to have a baby, you're usually, in Genesis, for example, kind of tracing God's chosen line of people, but through complicated figures. You know, Jacob, for example, and is also a complicated figure. And Samuel, the last of the judges in the book of Samuel, is the same. His mother is barren also. And Samuel, mostly a positive figure, but also we learn towards the end of his life, he's a bad father, and his sons have also gone astray. So I think it's in keeping, maybe this is even more pronounced for Samson, but it's in keeping with that pattern of God chooses people and sometimes even miraculously brings about their birth, and yet they make lots of mistakes, and they're very flawed people still. Jonathan?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, to reinforce the point you're making, it's like that pattern you see all throughout the Bible, where it's like Adam, they talk about before in previous classes, like Adam and Eve are set up and then things go bad, and then like Noah's set up and things go bad. It's like we keep having these promises, where it seems like things.
Right. Once you get to a high point, there's almost always like a crash after that.
And I guess in terms of like ancient interpretation, you can see it's typological, because like there's a lot that's like echoed in the John the Baptist story, like no strong drink and all that, and so it's like keep getting set up and then fail, and then like Jesus is the true Israel who comes and represents the nation.
Right. It doesn't fail. Yeah.
Wow.
Thanks, Jonathan. Did someone have a comment over here? Yes.
So one of the things that I think about often is history, literal. So one of the contentions in biblical scholarship as I've looked at it is calling into question the historicity of Adam and Eve. Are they just models? And then if you take that argument that people make and you come to the Judges, what is there that compels us to say these people actually lived, they breathed, they did things? They're not just a story being told.
I should know that I never can get away with teaching one of these classes without someone asking some huge question. So you weren't here the previous weeks, but everyone was asking me about violence and genocide. Now I have historicity, so thank you for that, Dean. In terms of history, there's nothing in this part of the Bible that can directly, no archaeological find or anything like that, that gives us direct evidence for any of the individual judges and the things that they did. But the general picture that we know from history and archaeology of this time period aligns with what we have in the Bible. So this is a time following this Bronze Age collapse where there were, previous to this, these big empires like Egypt who had a lot of control over this area. And we know that for some reason those empires collapsed around this time, and during this time period it was more like little smaller city-states. It's also the time when these sea people came across from the Aegean, including the Philistines, and settled there, and we can see that from archaeology. There's also Egyptian sources that mention the sea people, and so that general picture. You also have increasing Israelite settlements in the highland areas, so what the Bible calls like the hill country of Judah and the hill country of Ephraim. That's right in the middle of the land of Canaan, between the river and the sea. And you see from archaeology like more settlements in those places at that time. No pig bones in the settlements, which would align with Israel living there. So, so I would say that just in general, the situation described in Judges matches what we can see from archaeology and other historical sources during this time period. But I also think, just that you can see this is also really good literature, and that there's nothing wrong with not being able to verify all these details. That the points come through, and that it's also a literary creation. The book is a literary creation, and the events are arranged in a certain order, certain vocabulary is used to emphasize certain points. So to me, it's kind of, it's not just meant to be like a history textbook or something like that. Jonathan, do you have anything?
Just one super small point to add on to that is that in terms of the extra biblical written evidence, like inscriptional evidence from this period, there's hardly anything from this part of the world, and so it would be like if somebody thousands of years from now was trying to corroborate who is the president of the United States right now in 2024, and did Canada exist, and all you had was one paving stone from our courtyard that listed somebody's name and the dates that they lived. Now it's the only writing you have in this period. There's no way we could corroborate who the president was, and people might say oh, Canada, that's just made up, or something. It's like that's the stuff.
Yeah, we just don't have a lot of evidence, especially written evidence, which Jonathan is an expert in. So, thank you. Yes.
The doctrine or the theology that says that the scriptures are like a progressive revelation, where you have everything from Adam to the second Adam, Christ. All the leaders are flawed. All the judges, all the kings, all the prophets even have their limitations. And then suddenly you have this complete self-portrait of God in Jesus. He's the true Messiah. It almost seems like the way it's set up, you can't mistake one of these great leaders for the Messiah.
Yeah.
You can't do it.
Yeah.
And it's also pointing away from the idea of a Messiah who's going to fix everything.
Yeah.
conquer all the bad guys, happy ending story. It's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Bruce. Thank you. All right, any other observations on Samson in particular, or this text in particular, or questions that you had? He gives this riddle that's impossible, basically. It's based on his own experience with the lion. So he's already setting them up, not to be able to solve it. And then they can't solve it. And it's interesting. He gives them the riddle in the form of an answer. It's like Jeopardy or something, that he gives them the answer, but they come up with the question. It foreshadows his interactions with Delilah later in the story, because his wife is pestering him, nagging him, and he finally gives in and tells her. For some reason, it strikes me funny, the line about, I haven't told my father or my mother, why would I tell you? It's like we think now, kids are so attached to their parents in adulthood, but like Samson hasn't quite separated from his parents either. If he thinks like, obviously the people he would go to are his parents rather than his wife. And then they guess it because she told them. But it's interesting. They say, "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than the lion?" Which is the answer to the riddle. It's the honey that came out of the lion. But also, it's a kind of another riddle. And some people have pointed out that maybe they're saying, "What is sweeter than honey? Love or a woman's allure, and what is stronger than a lion? Samson, he killed a lion, but he couldn't resist, his wife's pestering him, the allure of love, and so maybe even their answer is another riddle that kind of hints at the power that women have over Samson, which is seen later in the story as well.
Joanna,
Yes.
Back to the structure here.
Yep.
I mean, it seems like Samson is setting up a fight.
Right.
And, I mean, the riddle is a conspicuous part of that, but so is this enormous value of 30 linen garments and 30 festal garments.
Right, in a time when a lot of people only owned one garment.
So, I mean, is it worth thinking about, like, why he's creating such a high-risk game?
I think so, yes. He's the one who leads with the riddle. He initiates the whole riddle thing, and yes, puts a very high bet on the finding out of the riddle. He probably feels confident in his bet because, he's the one who got the honey out of the lion, and he doesn't think they're going to be able to figure it out. But yeah, I do think it points to something in his character. He takes risks without thinking about it, and yeah, of course he's setting up for somebody to be upset about this, and they do get really upset. I mean, the wife gets the answer out of him because the people are going to burn her and her family up. So, I think he starts off this whole situation that leads to violence with the ill-advised riddle. And then it's interesting. So, he loses, and then the Spirit of God, the Spirit of the Lord rushes on him, which happens to the other judges. And usually when the Spirit of the Lord rushes on somebody, previously in the book, they go into battle and they defeat their enemies who've been oppressing them. In this case, Samson, the Spirit of the Lord rushes on him, and he kills 30 people in another town. Ashkelon's another Philistine town that's 20 miles or so away from where he is. So he kills 30 people who aren't involved in this at all, and takes their stuff, steals it, murders people to pay off the debt, and so to pay the bet. And so it seems like, God is involved in this somehow, but Samson seems to be misusing this spirit power, at least when we compare it with the previous judges who were actually delivering Israel. Samson has the Spirit of the Lord, and then he kills people to pay off the people related to the bet. And then as things play out, I'll just go through some of this stuff. We probably won't read this whole text, but I do want to show you how things kind of spiral out with violence after this. So it says at the end of the text, the part that you read in chapter 14, Samson's wife was given to his companion, so one of the people who was with him at the wedding. And then in the last paragraph on your handout, this is the beginning of chapter 15, Samson goes to visit his wife. He's gone away, and so his father-in-law thought, well, Samson doesn't want to marry her. He gave her to somebody else. Then Samson comes back, wants to be with his wife, and she's already been given to another man. So the father-in-law tries to get him to marry her sister, and he doesn't want to marry the sister. He wants this woman, and so. In verse 3 at the bottom of the page it says, "This time when I do mischief to the Philistines, I will be without blame." So he's saying, I'm justified in my actions. And maybe he's saying he wasn't justified in his last actions because he said this time. So what he does is he catches 300 foxes and puts torches on their tails and then sets them free in the Philistine fields to burn their grain, which is a big deal when you're living on subsistence agriculture and your field gets burned up by foxes running around, plus poor foxes that got themselves burned. And who is he hurting here? He's mad at the father-in-law and the woman, and he just sets foxes loose in people's fields. But it's not even his father-in-law that he sets the foxes free in their fields. I don't think he just sets them free it just says the grain of the Philistines. So then, the Philistines as a whole are mad at him. And so in verse 6, they say, "Who has done this?" And it was said to them, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he had taken Samson's wife and given her to his companion." So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father. So when she first told the riddle to him, it was to avoid her and her father's house being burned. Now, that happens to them anyway. And the Philistines, who have their field burned, instead of going to Samson, they go to the woman and the father-in-law, and they kill them. And it's just this spiral of violence where everyone's kind of missing the mark in their violence. And then Samson gets mad that they did that to his former wife, even though that's who he was mad at. He was mad at the father-in-law and the wife in the first place. And then it says in verse 8, "He struck them down hip and thigh with a massive defeat, and he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock of Aton." So it's not clear what that means exactly, hip and thigh, massive defeat, but he obviously must kill a bunch of Philistines. So this whole riddle has set off this cascade of violence with everybody taking vengeance kind of every which way. And as it plays out, we won't read the rest, I guess, but I'll just summarize as it plays out. The Philistines come to get Samson because he's just delivered this big defeat. And they encamp in Judah, the territory of Judah. And the people of Judah don't want to make trouble with the Philistines because the Philistines are ruling over them. And so they tie up Samson and hand him over. So it's a striking scene where the Israelites are tying up and handing over their own judge. And previously the judges were leaders of Israel. Now the Israelites are binding their own judge and handing him over to the enemy. Which, may be bad, maybe they're just self-interested, or maybe a good move. They're trying to avoid more violence, so they hand over the perpetrator, and they want to stop this violence. At any rate, Samson gets free of the ropes. He gets a jawbone of a donkey and kills a bunch of people. That's when he said this with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. There's a word play in there because donkey and heaps both have the same consonants. So he's kind of saying this alliterative poem. And if you compare it to the Song of Deborah also sings a song after her victory in battle, but she gives credit to God, talks about God, talks about the cosmic powers fighting for them and things like that, whereas Samson seems to be just kind of glorifying himself and his own victory in the battle. But then at the very end, he's thirsty, and he calls out to God, and God splits open a rock, or a hollow place, it says, and water came from it. So he, just like the Israelites in the wilderness, cried out to God when they were thirsty, God provided water for them. God does that for Samson here, too. So some people also see this as a negative kind of, self-interested thing. Samson only turns to God when he really, when he needs water, and he's self-interested. Other people see it as a positive kind of glimmer that, okay, well, at least Samson has some connection with God, and that he knows where to turn when he's in trouble, and God does hear his prayer and have mercy on him, and he gives him the water, and he even names this spring of the caller. He called out to God, and God gave him the water. So the whole thing is obviously complicated, but I do think what we've seen in Judges is this more and more violence, and also including intra-Israelite violence, and the violence is increasing, and now we see this judge who's intent on taking revenge, but kind of, does it in a misguided way. And what we'll see in the end of the book eventually is this kind of violence spiraling out of control. One more thing I want to point out about the Samson story is this motif of seeing. So Samson seemed, and this fits in with the measure for measure punishment theme that I'm looking at. Samson seems to always be going astray with regard to his eyes. So he saw the Philistine woman that he wanted to marry. He said, "She is right in my eyes." Then he saw the lion carcass, and that's when he ate the honey, which would have been unclean. Later, he saw a prostitute in Gaza, and he's staying overnight with the prostitute when the Philistines come to capture him, but he ends up getting away. Then there's a kind of, the tables are turned, because when he gets together with Delilah, who we think of as a prostitute sometimes, but the text does not say that she's a prostitute. So this is the third woman that he's been entangled with. When he is with Delilah, the Philistine leaders say, "Seduce him," which is usually something in the Bible said about men seducing women. In this case, it says, "Seduce him and see where his great strength lies." And so now we have, instead of Samson seeing, we have the Philistines seeing, Delilah seeing. Delilah sees that he told her the secret, and that's when they shave his head, his strength leaves him, the Philistines capture him, and then what do the Philistines do? They gouge out his eyes, and that's what's been leading him into trouble all this time, is his eyes. But that's not the end of the story. So Samson kind of seems to be getting what he deserves. He's going astray with regard to his eyes, and then that's what he loses, his eyes. But that's not the end of the story, because when he's in the Philistine temple, of course, famously, the Philistines are watching, and it uses that same verb about seeing 2 times. The Philistines saw Samson, and they praised their God, and then it says there were these 3,000 people who looked on, who they were seeing, while Samson was entertaining them. And then Samson gives his final prayer that God would give him this one last burst of strength so that he can be avenged for his eyes, and that's when his strength comes back, and the temple collapses, and he says he kills more Philistines in his death than in his life. And so it ends up being both Samson and the Philistines are destroyed, and both of them are kind of tied in with this motif of eyes. Comments or questions at this point? Yes, Abby.
So the foxes,
Yeah.
like 300 foxes is a lot of foxes.
Yeah, true.
And it doesn't say anywhere like Spirit of God came upon him,
Right.
or God brought the foxes.
Right.
Like it's a lot of foxes.
Yeah.
And so question, is foxes really foxes? Because
Yeah.
if they were like a domesticated fox dog sort of thing,
Yeah.
then maybe. But then, if foxes really are foxes, this is like the white hot anger that is not burning out. It is deliberate. It is
Yeah.
searching for foxes,
Yeah.
setting fields on fire, finding more foxes,
Yeah.
more fields on fire, like over and over and over.
Right. That would take you some time to capture 300 foxes. It's interesting. Well, some people say it's jackals, not foxes. I don't. Zoologically speaking, I'm not sure the difference, but the implications are wild animals that he's catching. And it's interesting, especially related to something I'll show you in a minute, but 300 is the same number of men that Gideon took into battle when God kind of culled the army and brought 300 men into battle with torches. And it was, in that case, in the view of the text, it's a positive thing. They win this battle with only 300 men with torches, and really they don't even fight because the Midianites turn against each other. Where in here you have 300 foxes, torches, and it's just about revenge. And you're right, there's no Spirit of God mentioned in this, and it must be deliberate if he's collecting so many foxes. It may be because we have those 2 similar numbers. Maybe a lot of numbers in the Bible are are symbolic, hyperbolic. They may not be. Did he literally count? 300, okay, 298, 299. Now I've got 300. Maybe not. But even so, it's a lot of foxes, and it must have been a lot of work for him to do this. And yes, I think it does show like the depths of the flaws in his character if he goes out and harms animals and is so deliberate about catching all these foxes or jackals, which would be very difficult. So it's a great point. All right, so I want to show you, and this will be related, I think. After we move to Samson, like I said, we kind of zoom out to see all of Israel. And we see some words in this book that appear multiple times in the book, and I pointed some of these out the first couple weeks. But these keywords that, when you look at how they're used in different contexts, they highlight the decline that we see throughout the book. So one of those is the word in Hebrew, takah. In takah, it can mean to blow a trumpet or to thrust like a sword or a knife. And I pointed this out when we were looking at Ehud. So Ehud, that left-handed judge, when he thrust his sword into the belly of Eglon, it uses this verb. And then it's the same one when he goes out into battle and he sounds the trumpet. So Ehud used this word is used twice. Thrusting the sword and blowing the horn into battle. Then you see the same verb when Yael is in the tent with Sisera. It says she thrust the tent stake into the guy's head. That's the same verb. And then you see the same verb really prominently in the Gideon story about blowing the trumpets. So the same verb is used for blowing the trumpets, and that's when they win the battle without even fighting. And then in the Samson story, though, when Delilah is trying to figure out the secret of Samson's strength, at one point he says, "You weave my hair into a web," and this plan doesn't actually work. But what's interesting is that the same exact phrase that's used when Yael drove the tent stake into Sisera's head, the exact same phrase is used. Takah and Yated drove the peg. Delilah drove the peg into his hair, and that's exactly the same as this drove the peg into his temple in chapter 4. So what the implication seems to be, in chapter 4, in the context of the Deborah story, we have this foreign woman, Yael, non-Israelite woman, killing the Israelite enemy general. But then when we get it in the case of Delilah, it's also a non-Israelite woman, but she's got the upper hand against Samson, who's Israel's judge. So Samson is the one in this really vulnerable position, and whereas before it was the enemies of Israel who are in this prominent position. So this is one that's really hard to come through in translation because it means such different things. You can't translate it the same way. But we see, Samson being put in this really vulnerable position by the end. The other one that we'll look at real quick is the word torch. And Deborah, she's called the wife of Lapidot, and that word means torches. So some people think she's more like fiery woman, a woman of torches. So Deborah is a woman of torches, or maybe that's her husband's name, but the torch word appears then. And then, just like I said, torches play a prominent role in the Gideon story, where they have these torches in the jars, and that's in a positive context. But then we see the torches, the last place the torches appears is Samson going out in the field, wrecking the grain with the torches. And so if you're following these words, you can see, as they use at the beginning, they're in these positive contexts of victory, Israelite victory, and then going on to either Israelite defeat or the defeat of the judge or the moral compromises of the judge. And now, just a little bit on the end of the book. So we zoom out to the end of the book after the Samson story. And we hear these two sets of narratives. One is in chapter 17 and 18, and one is in 19 through 21. 17 and 18 is the story of Micah and his idols. And it's this breakdown, really, in the religious sphere. We hear about this guy, Micah, who stole a bunch of silver from his mother. This is at the beginning of chapter 17. And then he gives it back to her, and she says, "Oh, thank you, bless you, my son," even though he's the one who stole it. "And now make it into an idol for me." And so he makes part of it into an idol, and also mentions an ephod, the same word that was used about the thing that Gideon set up that led people astray. And then he grabs this Levite, so someone from a tribe of Levi, and the tribe of Levi is set apart for special service to God in the tabernacle and later the temple. But instead of the Levite doing that kind of general service of God in the designated spaces of worship, he grabs this Levite to be his own personal priest. And he thinks like, okay, now I've got my own little shrine, I got my own little priest, and I'm all set. But then some people from the tribe of Dan, they're moving from one territory to another because they've gotten pushed out of their territory by the coast, and they're going up north. They're on their own little spy mission, just like all of Israel in the book of Numbers. They get wind of this, the idol and the priest, and they decide to steal it from Micah. So they go in, they convince the Levite to come with them, and they said, isn't it better for you to be a priest for us, for a whole group of people, rather than just this one guy? So they steal his idols, they run away, and Micah comes out and says, hey, why are you taking this stuff? And they're basically like, well, we're stronger than you, we'll take it. And so Micah, who stole the stuff, and take is a kind of key word here. Micah took the silver, stole it from his mother, made these idols, even though that was what she wanted in the end. Then he gets all his stuff taken from him. And there's really no good character in this story. Micah, the mother, the Levite, the tribe of Dan, everybody, as it says in verse 4, everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. And so you see a kind of breakdown in the religious sphere. Then we get to really probably the very darkest chapter in the Bible, Judges 19. And this is a kind of a breakdown, you could say, on a family sphere and on a society sphere. A really, really terrible story of a different Levite who's traveling with his concubine, and they're staying at the house of somebody that they come across, invites them in. The people surround the house and want the men to be sent out so that they can abuse them, but instead they send out the concubine, the woman, and she ends up dying in this terrible encounter. And if you read this story, which we're not going to read because it's too terrible for a Sunday school class, it has so many echoes of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, the story of Lot. And in that case, Lot was living in this Canaanite city, and it becomes this real symbol of evil and just utter depravity. And now what's happened here now this is happening here in Israel. And so the Israelites have become even worse than this, very wicked Canaanite city. And so it's kind of like Sodom and Gomorrah has come to Israel. That's the point of the story. It's a very terrible, very dark story, but it's not. That's the point. It's like things have gotten so bad in Israel. The Israelites chose to basically be like Canaanites, and we see in the end of the book they have become like Canaanites with sexual abuse, violence, sacrificing children, that kind of thing. And then there's this civil war that breaks out afterwards as a consequence of this event. And as I'll show you, we see this picture of the Israelites engaged in this kind of conquest against each other. So just like we saw in the Jephthah story where the Ephraimites are fighting against Jephthah, there's this intra-Israelite conflict. That's what just blows up at the end of the book. And this refrain continues. In those days there was no king. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. Which points, on the one hand, to the importance of a king. Seems to be anticipating the rise of David's line especially. But also there's a little ambivalence, I think, because the one story we saw about a king in Judges is Abimelech, and he was a terrible king. So king doesn't automatically mean that things are going to be good. It depends on the king, depends on the leader. A couple just details here to show how the conquest turns inward. We see these really deliberate verbal echoes. So like at the beginning of the book of Judges, this is right at the beginning, the Israelites ask God, who should go up for us first against the Canaanites to fight against them? And God says the tribe of Judah should go up, and they're victorious, and they are able to take this territory. And then the exact same language is used in the context of the civil war. They inquire of God, who shall go up to battle against the Benjaminites? They're fighting against the Benjaminites because the Benjaminites won't give up the people, the perpetrators of this event in Gibeah. So now they're battling not the Canaanites, but they're battling their own tribe, one of their own tribes, the Benjaminites. They're actually not successful, even though God says Judah should go up. That Judah is defeated. The next time, Judah is defeated again. The third time, they do defeat the Benjaminites, but it's not positive. It's just all really bad. And the battle, as it plays out, has these echoes of the battle at Ai. And Ai is one of the cities in Joshua that was conquered, one of the Canaanite cities that was conquered. And in the Battle of Ai, the people basically set these ambushes outside the city. They drew the people out of the city, and then they set the city on fire, and then the people were trapped. And that is in the book of Joshua. But now that's happening it's the same kind of battle. They set the ambushes, they draw the Benjaminites out of the city, then they burn the city, and the whole thing is very reminiscent of that Battle of Ai, but now they're fighting against their own people, the Israelites. And then it gets even worse because after they defeat the Benjaminites, they've killed all these people, including women. They vowed not to give their wives to the Benjaminites, but now they don't want the Benjaminites to totally die out as a tribe, and so they go to this city who didn't help them out, when they mustered for battle, nobody came from this city, Jabesh Gilead, and they go and they devote the city to destruction, which is a word that's only used one other time in Judges, but it's used in Joshua when they're supposed to devote certain cities to destruction, Canaanite cities. Only happens once at the beginning of Judges. Now they're devoting an Israelite city to destruction, destroying it. And this is kind of holy war type language, which I've said is not used a lot in the book of Judges. But now they're doing it to themselves, to their own city. They take the women, and then there aren't enough women, so they take more women at this festival. It's just so it ends up with more kind of sexual abuse and violence, and the whole thing is just completely terrible. And this is where the book ends, sadly. But like I said, we do kind of have this pointing forward in some sense to the need for a king, an actual good king, who is, in a sense, David. And if we're thinking typologically, we can see that even David fails at this, but ultimately pointing forward to Christ. Just to end on a bit more positive note, this idea of God making strength out of weakness, I mentioned this text before from Hebrews. This is the famous Faith Hall of Fame, and we see the judges are mentioned in this Faith Hall of Fame: Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, and then also talking about David and Samuel and the prophets. And the author of Hebrews says that through faith they conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, and were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign enemies to flight. And I think that, we can try to, some of these apply to the judges, some don't on the list, but I think that idea that the judges were made strong in weakness, a lot of them they're flawed character-wise, or they're marginal in society. God was working through Deborah, who's a woman. She doesn't even get a mention here, only Barak, but and Ehud, who's this kind of left-handed trickster. Jephthah, who's the son of a prostitute, cast out by his brothers. Gideon, who's fearful. God makes them strong in weakness. And so I just have a couple of questions that I hope you can ponder on your way. Is where do we need God to bring strength in our weakness? God continually works with people, even when they're flawed, even in difficult times, in these very dark times in Israel's history. We look around us, we are in very difficult times too. And where might God be working that we least expected? Who might God be working through that we wouldn't expect God to work through? We see throughout this book, people suffer these consequences for their actions. They plant seeds, of conflict, and it erupts into violence. And so I think, even though I would caution against us looking around us and seeing, something bad happens, blaming it on ourselves or something. But it can, I think, be fruitful to think, what kinds of, am I planting the seeds that will bring about peace, or am I planting seeds that are going to erupt in more conflict in family or work? And because, as we see, violence begets violence, but also love begets love, and peace begets peace, which we don't have as many examples of in the book of Judges, but we do have a few of those. And so I'll leave us there because we're at time, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk with you afterwards. So thank you for coming, and that's it for Adult Ed for the year.